Well, welcome and thank you for joining us for today's special program, History at High Noon, First Flight, in celebration of the 120th anniversary of the Wright Brothers historic flight this month. My name is Stacy and I handle adult education here at the North Carolina Museum of History, and we're so glad that you're here with us today. A few quick housekeeping items. We ask that you please keep your mics muted throughout the program and to please type any questions that you have for our guest speaker into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the program, our adult programs intern Destiny will ask our speaker as many of your questions as time allows. So it's my honor to introduce and welcome today's speaker, David True. David is an interpretive park ranger from Wright Brothers National Memorial, who has been an interpretive ranger in a variety of places around the country, including Yellowstone, Rocky Mountain, and Big Cypress, as well as having the opportunity to be a ranger at Dayton Aviation Heritage National Historic Park, where the Wright brothers lived and did much of their research. So David, I'm going to turn things over to you. Welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. All right. I'm glad to be here. I'll also let you know something about myself. I'm from Dayton, Ohio. I grew up there. And let me see here. And because I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, I learned a lot about the Wright brothers just being in that wonderful city. The Wright brothers used to say that Dayton, Ohio was a great place to grow up if you basically being from Ohio. But there's one question I always had growing up in the state of Ohio about the Wright brothers. I never thought it seemed like a great place that would attract pilots. You know, it didn't have anything special about the area that I really thought would be attractive for trying to fly. So what happened? How did these two young men get so excited and so interested in what it took to be able to figure out controlled flight? That was a big question, a big challenge when it came to the Wright brothers. Now, I do want to bring this up when it comes to the Wright brothers. They did not invent flying. Mankind could fly before the Wright brothers. We could fly kites, we could fly gliders, we had hot air balloons. The challenge was having controlled flight with a heavier than air sustainable machine, which we call today an airplane. That was the challenge. And there were a lot of people out there trying to figure out how to solve this problem. But the challenges remained, and it was something that only at first the Wright brothers were the ones that started with figuring out how to solve this complex issue. Now, just to kind of give you an idea, there's three words that I think are very important when you think about the Wright brothers. The first one is genius. Think about genius. What would it mean to you if you hear the word genius? I'm sure you have a thought about what that word might mean to you. And then another word I want to provide you is the word resolute, resolution. What does that mean to you? If you're resolute about something, what does it mean in your life? And then the last word I love to bring up is faith, F-A-I-T-H, faith. And what does that mean to you? It could mean so many different things. It could faith in a higher power, perhaps. Perhaps it means faith in your family and friends, loved ones. Whatever your feeling is, those three words are extremely important when it comes to the Wright brothers. And they're so important that they're listed right now on our monument on top of that 90-foot sand dune that we have at Wright Brothers with a 60-foot monument on it. So what they did is changed in the world, but let's go ahead and start how this happened and why they were interested in doing this. So this is a nice picture I have right here of Orville and Wilbur Wright. Wilbur is the little bit older gentleman there. He has a little bit less hair. Orville with a nice distinguished mustache. A little bit younger, about 4.5 years younger. Now, we consider them Daytonians. They were from Dayton, Ohio, although they actually grew up in a number of places besides Dayton, but they spent most of their early lives in Dayton, Ohio. But again, what made them get interested in aviation? When I think about the Wright brothers, I realize how much mathematics they had to have, the knowledge they had to be able to have to do what they did. To understand the physics and everything that went with the work they were doing. They must have learned from a phenomenal instructor, maybe a great college professor somewhere. It turns out they didn't go to college. And it wasn't because they weren't great students. It wasn't because they couldn't do it. They couldn't have the ability to go to school. The fact is, it just didn't happen for them for a variety of reasons. Now, for Wilbur Wright, He had plans to go to an Ivy League school. He was going to go to Yale University. And the plans were there for him to do this. He had wonderful grades, great student. He was athletic. He liked to play sports. He also didn't mind public speaking. He was comfortable talking to people. But an event happened that changed his life. And what happened is he was playing a game of ice hockey. And as he was playing this game, one of the players from the neighborhood team checked him in the face with a stick, and he lost most of his upper teeth. The result is that he ended up having to get fake teeth. He had digestive problems and health issues, and he also got depressed. Yeah, so he ended up not going to college. He ended up staying home and taking care of his mom, who was having some health issues. So the plans for going to school for Wilbur ended abruptly for him. Now, I had to add this to the story because I kind of think it's fascinating and maybe a little dark at the same time. The young man that hit him in the face is allegedly known as a man by the name of Oliver Crook Hall, Haugh. Now, if you look that name up, you're going to find out that he ended up becoming a serial killer in the Midwest. He actually killed 13 people, including 3 members of his own family, and he got the electric chair in the state of Ohio. Pretty horrible to hear all that, but we don't want to give a serial killer credit for the Wright brothers ended up being at Kitty Hawk. So we'll move on to Orville after this. Now, Orville Wright wasn't quite as great a student as Wilbur. He kind of snuck by trying to get good grades best that he could, but he was more of an average student. Really, the big thing, his heart really wasn't in going to school as much as Wilbur was. But Orville had was this great interest in how things worked. For instance, he once took a tombstone and he made a printing press out of it, basically, and that started his interest with eventually starting a printing press operation in Dayton, Ohio. So he actually started this business, a printing press operation, at the age of 15. And Wilbur, who was home at the time, ended up joining him, and the 2 young men had a successful business in downtown Dayton, Ohio. But again, where did they learn all this science from? Where did they learn this technology to be able to do what they did? Since they did go to college, I think we have to look at home now and figure out where they learned and who they learned all those abilities they had. You had to look at their parents. Now, their dad, his name was Milton Wright, and Milton Wright was a bishop of the United Brethren Church of Christ. His job was basically with the bishop, as a bishop, was doing administrative duties for the church. And he often had to travel to the western parts of the region away from Dayton, Ohio, to go to other congregations and do administrative duties for the church. Now, because he was gone for long periods of time, sometimes when he would come home, he would bring a gift home for the kids. And one of those gifts was this. This was called the bat. And it was a little wind up propeller toy. Basically, it was a design created by a Frenchman by the name of Pinard, who at the time when he built this machine, it actually was one of the first type of aviation machines that actually worked and could fly. Well, when the Wright brothers got this toy, they loved it so much that they played and played and played with it until the toy finally gave out and broke. Now, you would think that as children, perhaps when you lose your favorite toy, maybe you kind of just move on to something else. The Wright brothers didn't. They loved this toy so much that they decided they were going to build a new toy, make it better, and try to even perhaps sell it to the neighborhood kids. Well, they attempted to make one that may have been a little bit bigger, didn't fly as good, but already as children, the Wright brothers were fascinated with aviation. So this toy, the bat, and they call it the bat because when it flew, it looked like a bat in flight. This toy was a major spark in the lives of the Wright brothers, and one of the reasons they did get interested in aviation. Now, Milton Wright, the dad again, he also had this huge library at home. Upstairs library was books on theology. The downstairs library had books on geography and history and science. And he wanted his kids to learn everything they could about the world around them. It was very important to have that education. But Milton was also wanting all the kids to understand that family always came first before the outside world. You can learn about the outside world, but trust your family first. So that was extremely important when it came to Milton. Now, to be honest about Milton Wright, Milton probably wasn't the strongest person when it came to mathematics and science. I mean, his skills in mathematics and science probably were a little bit lacking. So now we got to look at the other person in the family. That person's name was Susan Wright, the mom. Now, I'm going to let you know something. There are two amazing women in the Wright family. And these two women were so vital to the Wright brothers and having success out here that you can't skip over them. They are vital to everything that happened to the Wright brothers. Now, the first one I'm going to talk about is Susan Wright. Susan Wright, the mom, what's fascinating about her, her dad was a wagon maker. And when she was growing up, because her dad had his skill in building things and using tools, she learned to use tools. She could fix pretty much almost anything that broke in the house. She could build sleighs and things that required more of an engineering background for the kids. And not only that, she ended up going to a college called Hartsville College in Indiana. She didn't quite get a degree because she ended up marrying Milton, and that took her away from being able to finish her degree at the last second. But she had skills in mathematics and science from the school. So here's this wonderful woman that had abilities in engineering, science, and mathematics, could use tools, could fix things. And since Milton wasn't home a lot because he had to do a lot of work away from Dayton, she had the responsibility of taking care of the house. Frankly, if Milton would have been home, probably still have been Susan kind of fixing things. So she had to know how. She taught her kids the love of science, the love of learning, and basically giving them that mechanical aptitude. I love this story because, let's face it, from this time period, women didn't always get the credit they deserved. And a lot of women didn't even have the opportunity to go to college. And here's Susan Wright with his engineering background. I think that is just so absolutely wonderful. Now, as the Wright brothers were growing up from this environment, they had this printing press operation we were talking about. It was working pretty good. They were making some money as young men, but there was a problem was having this kind of a business in Dayton, Ohio. The problem was Dayton was growing really fast. It was a pretty big city, and there were a lot of men moving there that were very progressive minded, and some of them had printing press operations, and many of those men had more money and resources. The Wright brothers really couldn't compete with some of these men. So they were looking to do something else. What could two young men that had inventive minds do that could make some money, have some fun, and maybe be involved with technology? Well, the exciting thing going on in the late 1890s and really from the 1880s on was this new bicycle that came out from Europe. This bicycle, it was called a safety bicycle. And the safety bicycle looks a lot like the bicycles we have today. Basically, the pedals were right below the seat. The chain went to the back wheel. The front wheel and the back wheel were almost the same size. But the great thing about a safety bicycle, it was easy to learn to ride. It was practical. You could pretty much ride it anywhere. It wasn't super expensive. A lot of people could buy one of these. Well, that was important because before the safety bicycle, if you owned a bicycle, that front wheel was this high off the ground. You had the pedals in the front. And the only reason you had this bicycle was to show off. That was it. But the new safety bicycle, now, not only could you ride all over the town you lived in, you could ride to neighboring towns as well. There were people out there that thought the safety bicycle was immoral. You shouldn't have one. It's taking you away from doing the work you need to be doing at home. But it didn't stop the safety bicycle from catching on. The Wright brothers had a safety bicycle, and they were fascinated with how this machine operated. They were fascinated with how to put one together and fix them. So the Wright brothers eventually started a company up in Dayton, Ohio. They had a variety of names, but the name they settled on at the end was the Wright Cycle Company. And that company allowed them to continue their interest with mechanical items. But also think about this. What do you have to do to be able to ride a bicycle? The key for riding a bicycle is that you have to learn balance and control. Because on a bicycle, if you're going to turn, you have to be able to turn your handlebars, which is your yaw control, Y-A-W, left and right. And then you basically have to go do a roll, just like you do with pretty much an airplane. Well, the only difference between flying a glider and operating a bicycle is going up and down. That's pitch. That's the one big difference. So the fact is, when the Wright brothers had this wonderful machine, this bicycle, they didn't lose their interest for being able to fly that they had as they were younger. In fact, this encouraged their interest more and more all the time. And the Wright brothers followed the exploits of other aviators at the time, men like Samuel Langley, Octave Chanute, Otto Lienthal. Well, a couple of men I want to show, at least what they did. This is a picture of an airplane called the aerodrome. Now, this is a picture of it kind of falling apart after it was flown off a boat. But this plane was created by a man by the name of Samuel Langley, who in 1896 built the steam version power of this plane. It wasn't built to have a pilot on board, but he flew it for the military. And the Army was so impressed with it, they started giving him money to build a full-size one that he could actually fly off with a pilot. Well, get to about 1903, Samuel Langley develops this machine. And this aerodrome basically is full size now. It's going to have a pilot. He develops a catapult system to be able to take it off a boat. But twice when he tried to have it flown off a boat, the pilot both times when the plane went off the boat, basically ended up in the river, the Potomac River, and the plane disintegrated twice as it went off the boat. Now, Samuel Langley was one of the great American scientists at the time. And you can look at this two ways. If he can't be able to figure out how to fly, how's anybody else going to do it from this country? But at the same time, if a man with the prestige of Samuel Langley is interested in flight, then perhaps flying is something we should be looking at. So the Wright brothers looked at it that way, and they followed Samuel Langley, even as he tried to fly right before the Wright brothers did in the year 1903. So, but he wasn't the only person that was important to the Wright brothers. I have a picture here of another man. His name was Octave Chanute. Now, Octave Chanute is a hero of mine, and I'll tell you why. Octave Chanute was born in Paris. He came to this country as a child, ended up going to college. He became an engineer, and he was a phenomenal engineer, one of the great engineers in the United States at the time. His main job as an engineer was building, creating, designing stockyards. Now, he did this in Kansas City, and he did this in Chicago. Think about what's important with Kansas City and Chicago: livestock, lots of food, basically moving food around. If you have a successful stockyard, your city is going to grow really fast. And that's because in many ways, what Octave Chanute designed allowed Chicago to become the city what it is today. Now, Octave Chanute had a hobby. His hobby was aviation. He liked to build gliders. He was very curious about controlled flight, something that was challenging mankind at the time. And then basically, Octave Chanute would take these gliders that he would build, and he'd have other people fly them at a place called Indiana Dunes near Chicago. Well, the great thing that I love about Octave Chanute is by the time he had so much money and time, basically retired, he was able to focus entirely on aviation. He started building lots of gliders, trying to figure out how to fly them. And then he'd have other men fly them at Indiana Dunes. He couldn't do it because of his age. But think about this. For anyone that's getting ready to retire or anyone that is retired, if you're like Octave Chanute, your best is still ahead. So just keep that in mind. And the Wright brothers followed Octave Chanute. They used to correspond a lot about the recent things going on in flight. In fact, the book that the Wright brothers were using was written by Octave Chanute, and he was taking information from other pilots in the past to figure out the formulas for lift and drag, and it was the standard at the time. So Octave Chanute was an important figure in the case of the Wright brothers. But there's one thing that really changed everything, and I know it's not going to look like much. You see, it doesn't look like much. It's just this rocky little outcrop on the Great Miami River near downtown Dayton, Ohio. It was called Pinnacles Point. Basically, it wasn't a place that you really did anything with other than the fact that you picnicked there. And there was a little road that you could take your bicycle out when you were working, and you rode out here. And if you were the Wright brothers, you had a sandwich, you had something to drink, but you became bird watchers. This was a prime bird watching area. And the birds they particularly liked watching were turkey vultures. Why? Now, I'll let you know, the Wright brothers called them buzzards at the time. But keep in mind that mankind was struggling figuring out controlled flight. Well, birds have no trouble flying whatsoever. How are they doing it? The Wright brothers were fascinated with how birds were controlling themselves in the air. But most birds are not big enough to be able to see what they're doing with their wings, or they move too fast. But a turkey vulture is a little different. It's slow, it's big. When they're flying around, they tend to fly in a dihedral, which is basically their wings out like this. They're teetering around in the sky like this. But if you look carefully, you can see how they're bending their wings to get control in the air. And everybody can do this. The next time you see a turkey vulture, look carefully with how it's bending its wings to get control in the air. That's the key. Now, because of this, one day, Wilbur Wright goes back to the Wright Cycle Company. He's inadvertently playing with a box. It's just basically an inner tube box. And as he's playing with this box and he moves one end of it, the other end moves in a weird way. And it reminds him of that turkey vulture. And Wilbur Wright starts to think that this might be something we can replicate. So he starts working on building a kite. And this kite, they're going to build in 1899. Basically, it's going to move its wings like a turkey vulture. He's going to control this by lines. After he builds it, he flies it in a churchyard. He has the help from some of the neighborhood kids that are living in the area as he's flying it. And the controls he's using is causing that kite to dive and come back up. And it's working great. In fact, some of the kids that were with him were kind of concerned. They kept ducking because he kept diving this kite right over their heads. So it was kind of a challenge for them to be out there with him. But the fact is, the kite worked great. And that concept of bending the wings to create a roll would eventually be called wing warping. That was a very important concept for the Wright brothers. So now, the fact that they had the successful kite and it was working pretty good, the next step would be flying a glider. But there was a problem with this. You see, the problem was they were in Dayton, Ohio. Dayton was a great place to grow up, but the Wright brothers didn't think Dayton would be very good for flying a glider. And there are three reasons why. The first reason was this. The Wright brothers were kind of concerned they didn't have the steady winds they needed. And they needed to have at least 10 to 20 mile an hour consistent winds. Now, Dayton, Ohio doesn't have those kind of winds. For the most part, it tends to be erratic. So that was an issue. There was a second issue. That second issue was the Wright brothers were kind of concerned that basically Dayton wouldn't be a safe place to land at. There wasn't a lot of soft areas there, nothing like sand. So the Wright brothers were thinking a sandy environment might give them some extra protection, plus a sand dune. Perhaps that would make a nice place to be able to actually fly a glider at or a kite. But the third reason might be the biggest reason of all. You see, that problem was Dayton was growing. And as Dayton was growing and all these men were moving to Dayton, the Wright brothers were kind of concerned that if they come up with this wonderful thought of controlled flight and they're doing these experiments in Dayton, Ohio, somebody might be watching them from behind and suddenly perhaps steal their ideals. They didn't want that to happen. They wanted to have isolation. So the reason you leave Dayton, Ohio is wind, sand, and isolation, but it doesn't mean they're coming to Kitty Hawk. It doesn't mean they're coming to North Carolina. They're not exactly sure where they're going to go. The Wright brothers were kind of lost a little bit about this. Wilbur was doing a lot of research. He was looking at national weather stations around the country and what places may have the most windiest, nicest environments to try to fly at. But they also had Octave Chanute, their friend, corresponding with them, and Octave suggests a couple places as well. Octave suggests Chicago, the Windy City is where he's at. A lot of people in Chicago. Wright brothers decided ultimately not Chicago, not going to go there. Well, what about Florida? What about California? Places like that would probably be very good places to do this work at, but kind of far away from Dayton, Ohio. Suddenly, Octave does suggest some place by the name of the Outer Banks. The Outer Banks. And, Wilbur Wright, he saw that the Outer Banks, Kitty Hawk, the town that's there, was the sixth windiest spot, according to weather station data that they had. So it seemed promising. As a coastal area, probably has sand. And the biggest metropolis at the time in the Outer Banks was some town by the name of Kitty Hawk. And in that town, there were about 60 people living there. So the Wright brothers thought, you might have isolation here. Seemed like a good thing. So Wilbur Wright writes a letter. It's answered by a man by the name of Joseph Dosher. He's the one weatherman that works at Kitty Hawk. And Mr. Dosher is going to respond back to the Wright brothers by basically saying, yes, we got wind, we have sand, we have isolation. But Mr. Dosher does something that changes the whole narrative of the story. He gives that letter to the commissioner of the area. The man's name is William Tate. And William Tate is largely going to proclaim and write back to the Wright brothers by saying that the people at Kitty Hawk would welcome the Wright brothers there. So when the Wright brothers decide they're going to come to Kitty Hawk, basically you can add a fourth reason why they came out here. It was Southern hospitality. Now, that being said, Wilbur's going to be the first to come out here in the mid to late summer of 1900. Orville couldn't go with him because Orville was taking care of the bicycle shop. He had to get somebody to replace him before he could head out here. So as Wilbur comes down here, he's bringing the fabric and wood for helping to build kites and gliders. He has his personal belongings. Takes him almost a week to get to Kitty Hawk. It takes him about 2 days by train to get to Elizabeth City. But when he gets to Elizabeth City, he couldn't find a boat captain to take him over. Well, why? Nobody knew where Kitty Hawk was. It was a kind of an unknown commodity at the time. It was a small, quaint fishing village. The one person that he met that had a boat that was willing to take him over was a man by the name of Israel Perry. Israel Perry was born in Kitty Hawk, so he knew where it was. The only problem was Israel is that he had this really rackety boat. It barely worked. And when he took Wilbur Wright to Kitty Hawk, there was a storm, there were waves, and the boat was taking on water. And Wilbur was thinking, we're not going to make it. Luckily, Israel was able to take that boat, find a kind of a area where he didn't have quite the bad waves and wind, rode it out. The next morning, they dumped the water out of the boat, and they finally make it to Kitty Hawk. And Wilbur, who's more than happy to see this landscape, to see this island and get off that boat, is looking for the Tate's house, who he talked to for coming over here. He sees a teenager and he asked the teenager, do you know where the Tates live at? He did. He took him over to the house and Wilbur was on Kitty Hawk. Now, Orville would follow perhaps a few weeks later. Orville was a photographer. He loved to take pictures. He had a really nice camera. And Orville took a picture of the landscape they were at. I want to show you one of those pictures. This is a picture of the Kitty Hawk area. Basically, in 1900, what does it look like to you? Do you see a lot of trees? If you came out here today, you see trees and grass everywhere. And of course, lots of people. But at this point, this was all sand. There's a few buildings, a few scattered trees, but it was all sand. It was one giant beach. And put it this way, Orville actually went up to Wilbur one day while he was out here and he said in his ear, I imagine this is what the Sahara Desert must look like if we ever have a chance to go there. But the Wrights had what they wanted. They had wind, they had sand and isolation, and they went to work immediately. They actually had a glider they built in Dayton, Ohio that they took apart, put back together here in Kitty Hawk. Now, that glider was using that concept of wing warping, and they were trying to fly it from sand dunes that were scattered about the Kitty Hawk area. But although the wing warping was working reasonably good, the lift wasn't. They were having trouble keeping it up off the ground. So they often just used that glider as a kite. They tethered it to the ground. But that doesn't mean that somebody didn't have the opportunity to fly that kite from above the ground while the Wright brothers held it from below. Often that was this young man. His name was Tom Tate. He was a 10, 11-year-old nephew of William Tate. And you can see a picture of the glider right behind him, or the kite in this case, and a big fish that he's holding right there. But I don't know how you would feel about this. If you were 10 years old, do you think that you would be like to fly on a kite from above the ground while somebody held it from below? You know, I sometimes joke about this. I wonder if that even be allowed today. I'm not sure, but think about that. So the Wright brothers were able to get a lot more good information about flying and their kites and gliders from the work they were doing with Tom as they controlled it from the ground. They knew they had to improve the lift. So then when they went back to Dayton at the end of the season, the Wright brothers went to work to improve the wings. They tried to change the camber, which is the shape of the wings, so it would get better lift. They made it larger. And when they came back at the Kitty Hawk in 1901, they expected great things. They thought this glider would be the best thing ever. They thought they would conquer control. But when they tried to fly this new glider, it went a little bit further than the last one, but not by much. This 1901 glider wasn't working they expected to. And at the result from all this, as the Wright brothers were starting to get a little dejected. In fact, they ended up leaving before the summer was over to go back to Dayton, Ohio, because they didn't like the results they were getting. And there was even thoughts that they might even quit. In fact, on the train going back to Dayton, Ohio, Wilbur leans over to Orville and he tells him in his ear, man's not going to fly for 50 years. But when they get home, on the table of their house is a letter from Octave Chanute. Now, Octave Chanute's in charge of an engineering club, basically a science club full of scientists in the Chicago area. And he wants Wilbur to come to Chicago, speak to all these scientists. And, Wilbur can be a very good public speaker, but Wilbur doesn't want to go. He feels like he's failing right now. He doesn't think that it would be worth his time to go up there and perhaps make a fool of himself in front of all these men. So he's going to respectfully tell Octave, no, I'm not going to go. That's when somebody else in the Wright family has to stand up and kind of guide Wilbur along to head to Chicago. And that person's name was Catherine Wright, the sister. Now, I mentioned these two amazing women in the Wright family, Catherine Wright and Susan Wright, the mom. Catherine Wright was the youngest member of the Wright family by far. Of the 7 children, she was the youngest one. But she was the only one in the family who had a college degree. She went to Otterbein, got a degree, and she was skilled in Latin and English. Ended up being a school teacher in the Dayton, Ohio area, but also worked in the bicycle shop for the Wright brothers as they needed for help. But she loved her brothers. When her mom, Susan Wright, passed away from tuberculosis, Catherine ended up taking responsibility of the mom for all the older brothers in the family. And when she said something, you listened to her. She was so respected. When she saw that Wilbur was hedging on going to Chicago, she strongly influenced him to please think about going to Chicago. Do this, thinking it would do him some good. And Wilbur relents. He takes the train. He goes to Chicago. He meets Octave Chanute. He meets all these scientists. And as he's there talking to all these scientists, I don't know if anyone's ever watched a cartoon when a light bulb pops in over somebody's head when an ideal hits. Kind of what happened to Wilbur. You see, suddenly he starts to think that maybe the issue he's having with these gliders isn't necessarily the wing shape. Maybe the problem is the formula for lift they're using. They were using a formula for lift based from Otto Lilienthal's work as a German pilot flying gliders in Europe that was transcribed in a book by Octave Chanute. But perhaps these numbers weren't right. So Wilbur Wright, he goes back to Dayton. He gets with Orville. They actually build a wind tunnel. And this wind tunnel, they're largely trying to figure out. Basically, doing experiments to try to figure out what the right number for the formula for lift would be. They ended up changing the formula for lift. It's barely different than what it is today. And for me, my opinion about this, that fascinates me, I think is so amazing, is that the Wright brothers changed a whole scientific formula, and they didn't learn this from a professor. They learned this from Susan Wright, their mom. That's where they learned their math. Now that happened, and they had this new formula for lift, they went to work building a new glider. This next glider for 1902 was much better. Better controls, better shape. When they flew it from the sand dunes that were scattered about Wright brothers from the Kitty Hawk area, they were getting better results. But every now and then, something wouldn't fly right. For instance, they would sometimes have an issue what we call reverse yaw, when it does the opposite of what they wanted to do. And that glider would lose control. It would go nose first in the ground, leaving a gigantic hole in the ground. It was this hole in sand. It looks like a big golf hole. But the Wright brothers actually had a name for digging that hole with the glider. They called it well digging. If you kind of understand, maybe digging a well with a glider is probably not a very good thing. And the Wright brothers realized they had to improve that. They realized what the issue was. They thought all they needed to turn that machine was the wing warping. They did not take into account the rudder. They actually had a parallel rudder to the ground that was used for balancing the glider for flight, but not for turning. So the Wright brothers changed it. They made the rudder vertical. They had it move in conjunction with the wings. When they would be laying on their belly in a hip cradle, they would move their hips to be able to turn the wings, and now it turned the rudder at the same time. Once they did this, they accomplished control. They did 700 to 1,000 glider flights in 2 months, September and October of 1902, and they broke almost all the record for gliders. It was at this point that the Wright brothers knew that the next step, flying a heavier than air sustainable machine that could be controlled by a man, we called it the airplane. They had no doubt they would do this. The question is, would they beat others before it happened? So when they went back to Dayton, Ohio at the end of 1902, they had to figure out how to build an engine. The Wright brothers were great engineers, great scientists, never built an engine their entire life, didn't know how to do this. But they do have a mechanic that works for them. The man's name is Charlie Taylor. Charlie Taylor was a phenomenal bicycle mechanic, but Charlie also told the Wright brothers, I think I can help you build this engine. And the Wright brothers are more than happy to have Charlie help them to do this. So they all get together trying to figure out how to do it. The first thing they try to do, maybe we can just get an engine donated to us from a car company, an early car company. Well, that's not going to work because the engine that the Wright brothers need has to be under 200 pounds and it has to have at least 8 horsepower. Early car engines, they're way over 200 pounds. That's not going to work. So the Wright brothers realized we're going to have to make our own engine. So along with Charlie, they figure it out. The engine they end up designing is basically going to be under 200 pounds. It's going to have 12 horsepower. It looks like a diesel engine. It has no carburetor, no spark plugs. Reason why? It's crude. It's barely works. It has a 1-gallon gravity-fed gas tank that flows down and basically hits a hot engine. The heat's what causes the explosion. That's the power. This airplane engine wasn't meant to go very far, but it did work. Now, the key was how do they keep it under 200 pounds? They realized they had to use a different kind of metal than most people were using for engines at the time. They used a metal called aluminum. They put Alcoa aluminum from Pittsburgh in the engine block, and that is what kept it under 200 pounds. The only issue was the Wright brothers wanted secrecy. They didn't want people stealing their ideas. So they painted everything in the engine black, including the aluminum, so it wouldn't stand out. Now they had their engine, you need something that's going to cause that machine to go forward, and that would be a propeller. Well, the Wright brothers, in their genius, kind of realized that maybe thrust going forward was not too different than lift going up. And what do you need for lift? A wing shape. That changes the pressure of the air to allow you to rise. Why not try that with a propeller? So they do a variety of wind tunnel experiments with different shapes of wings, rotary wings. In the end, they developed this wonderful propeller that basically has 66% efficiency. I know it's just a number saying that, but that rivals things that we have today for the same kind of propellers that they had. It's really kind of amazing that the Wright brothers did this. And the propellers they end up using, basically they carved out a piece of wood with a hatchet, sanded it down, varnished them. And yet any airplane today that uses propellers is basically almost the same as what the Wright brothers did for the Wright Flyer. Now, the Wright brothers did not invent propellers, but what they did invent was a propeller that could fly. That was the key. Now you have to build the airplane itself. That airplane is going to be a lot bigger than those gliders, 40 feet across wingspan, 605 pounds in weight. It's going to be 510 square feet in size. It's big, a lot bigger than those gliders. It has to be able to handle all that weight. Well, it's so big, they can't build it in Dayton, Ohio like they do with with all the gliders they're flying. They're only going to build parts in Dayton. Most of it's going to be built at Kitty Hawk. So when they come up with the plans to do this, before they head out for the summer of 1903, the Wright brothers have a meeting with Dad. His name was Milton Wright again. And Milton has something to say that would change the course of history for the Wright brothers. And it was this: I want you back home by Christmas. Well, the Wright brothers said they would be. So they head out to Kitty Hawk in the late summer of 1903. They already had a building set up for a hangar in 1903, but that building got wiped off by a storm and they had to rebuild it. They realized after they rebuilt it wasn't big enough for the airplane, so they built another building, a hangar for the airplane, turned the other building into a camp building, and then they started testing everything out to see if everything was working okay. Well, the engine has a lot of torque and vibration, and things are breaking, including the propellers that's attached to it. And in 1903, if something breaks in wood in Kitty Hawk, you got to go back to Dayton to fix it. Twice the Wright brothers had to go back to Dayton. The second time was Orville Wright going to Dayton to build new propellers. By the time he gets back up here, it's December of 1903. And when the Wright brothers are finally ready to try to fly, according to Dad, they're running out of time, but they're ready to fly now. They've done enough experiments. Now, they do have one issue. They're on a sandy environment. They can't use wheels in the sand. So they're going to use a rail, a 60-foot rail. They're going to put 3 hubs, bicycle hubs on that rail, a dolly is sitting on the hubs, and the Wright Flyer will sit on the dolly. Now, that skinny rail means the plane's a little bit off balance. So one of the brothers is going to have to hold on to the wings when they take off while the other one flies it. The other issue is it's going to require manpower to get set up, a lot more than what they could do. So luckily for the Wright brothers, at the beach was basically the Kill Devil's life-saving station. Now, the men there told the Wright brothers, we'll help you out to get set up. If you just have to give us a sign, let us know. So the Wright brothers decided they're going to fly December 14th. That's the day they figure they can fly because the weather's supposed to be nice. And they put a sheet up on the outside of the camp building. That's the marker. The men come from the life-saving station. They come, get everything set up. The only question is who's going to fly the plane. And you know what? I'm going to guess if you have a brother or a sister, what do siblings have a tendency to do a lot? Fight and argue. And the Wright brothers used to argue all the time with each other. Well, to solve that issue, they flipped a coin. Wilbur wins the toss. He's going to be the first pilot. So as Wilbur climbs on board after they get the propellers moving, plane's being held back by a restraining line, Orville's going to be in the sand balancing the wings. When Wilbur releases the restraining line, that Wright Flyer starts rolling down the rail. But keep in mind, neither brother has flown this airplane before. So Wilbur, who's holding on to a pitch control, which is on the front, the elevator on the front of the plane, as it gets near the end of the rail, he pushes back on the pitch, but he pitches maybe a little bit too fast. And the result is that Wright Flyer begins to lift, but it lifts too steeply, it stalls, and then goes right back to the ground, nose first, and breaks. No sustained flight, 3.5 seconds in the air. The plane was broken. It had to fix it again. No issues. The Wrights thought they could fix it pretty quickly. And Wilbur Wright was ecstatic. Why was he happy? That plane could fly, and they knew it. Luckily, they were able to get that plane fixed and ready to fly on December 17th. Now, when December 17th came around, it was not a very nice day. It was 34 degrees outside. There was winds coming from the north at 27 miles an hour. And there was ice all over the ground. But the Wrights put their warmest, nicest clothes on. They put the sheet up on the outside of the camp building. That's the marker. And the men from the life-saving station come over and get everything set up. It's Orville's turn to fly. But Orville is also a photographer. He's got the camera set up in the sand where he hopes to get the best picture. The problem is, how's he going to take a picture if he's flying the plane? So he asked one of the men from the life-saving station, the man's name is John Daniels, would you mind taking the picture for us? Now, at that time, cameras weren't real common, and a lot of people didn't know much about cameras. John tries to explain to Orville, I've never really seen a camera before. Orville tries to explain to John, it's kind of like a gun. Basically, it's pointed, it's ready to go. If you see anything happen, squeeze the bulb. And John says he can do that. So once that's taken care of, Orville and Wilbur get the engines going. Orville's going to climb up safely in the back of the plane, get in the hip cradle while Wilbur's in the sand balancing the wings. About 10:35 a.m. on a December 17th morning, Orville releases a restraining line. The Wright Flyer begins to roll. As it starts picking up speed going towards the end of the rail, Orville remembers how Wilbur perhaps went a little bit too fast on the controls. So he gradually pulls back on the control. Suddenly, that Wright Flyer begins to lift a foot off the ground at first as the dolly goes in the sand, 2 feet, 4 feet, 6, 8, maybe 10 feet off the ground. Now, if you could watch us in person, it wouldn't have been pretty because that Wright flyer was barely controllable. Orville's doing everything he can to fly it. It's bouncing up and down, left and right. He flies as far as he can, 12 seconds, 120 feet. When the plane hits the ground, it wasn't pretty, but it's the first time in history that mankind had flown and controlled an airplane. But it wouldn't even be the last for that day. The Wright brothers would fly 3 more times that day. Each time it was a different brother, and every flight they had more confidence in the last. On the 4th flight, it was Wilbur Wright going 852 feet, 59 seconds in the air, maybe a height of 14 feet off the ground. But when the plane landed on that 4th flight, it sustained a little damage. The Wright brothers didn't think anything of it. They thought they could fix it. So they removed the elevator off the airplane. They walked it back over to the camp building, the hangar, put it in the sand, walked away briefly. It was a windy day though. And the result was, as they walked away, a strong gust of wind came and it lifted that Wright flyer up. It tossed it in the sand. And as it tossed it in the sand, parts of the plane broke. The engine broke. The wings broke. The struts broke. But the biggest issue was the engine, because that was something they couldn't fix here at Kitty Hawk. The Wright flyer would never fly again. And the Wrights picked up the pieces they could. They went back to the weather station where they could send basically communications back to Dad saying they had success. And then they took a boat and train back home to Dayton, Ohio. Now, the only question is, was there documentation? Was there any kind of documentation? Because John Daniels was so excited when that Wright flyer lifted off the ground. He didn't know if he squeezed the bulb or not. But when the Wright brothers went back home, they developed their photos. They were more than happy to see that John Daniels squeezed the bulb at the right moment. And when the most important photos in the history of mankind was taken, a photo that would forever change our world and will continue to change our world and from our lives from here on out. The Wright brothers had flown an airplane. Now, I would like you to think about what would have happened if the Wright brothers wouldn't have done this here at Kitty Hawk. What if they weren't interested in flying? Would we be flying today? In my opinion, my humble opinion is yes, we would be flying today. But we don't know how that would have looked. We don't know what the timetable would have been, how things would have changed. What we do know is what happened with the Wright brothers and how that has changed our world. Why this area, Kitty Hawk, those sand dunes that we have here, basically tell us the story of how the Wright brothers were able to accomplish what they did. It still stands as one of the great moments in history, not only for Americans, but for everyone around the world. Think about the changes that we've had with the flight that changed our commerce, our ways of defending ourselves, the way we explore, and also just our culture in general. Flight has done all that. So I'm going to leave you with the words of one of my heroes. The man's name was John Glenn. And John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth. But John, he loved to fly in jets as a passenger. And he once wrote this about being a passenger on a jet. He said, "I like getting a window seat because I've never lost my sense of wonder about looking at the world from above." That's the magic of Wright Brothers. That's why we're here today. And that's why I think is one of the great stories in mankind. So I'm happy to be here today. Thank you for your program, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
All right, if anybody has any more questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. I'm gonna go ahead and start off with the few that I do have. How long were these engines built to last?
That's a good question. That first engine, they didn't really have a timetable for how long they were built to last. They were just trying to get one that was going to be operational. But that first airplane engine they built would not have gone much further than what they did. If they wouldn't have had the plane hit the ground, it wouldn't have gone much further than that. In time, the Wright brothers started building much better engines as they had more know-how and more knowledge for doing it, and they had other people helping them build the engines. They would eventually build much better engines that would be able to do much longer flights. In fact, we often think of, we may say the Wright Flyer, that first one in 1903 might be the first airplane, but it was not a practical airplane. The first practical airplane came in 1905. That was a plane that could fly up to 39 minutes at a time, fly 22 miles at a time. And that plane was developed by the Wright brothers. It was the third Wright Flyer.
We have a question from Emily. The wood they used, was it balsam for a lighter plane?
They used a variety of wood and fabric. So they used spruce, they used pine, they used basically what they could get. And I think a lot of that had to do wherever they were located at with the equipment they were getting. I know that when he came down to North Carolina, Wilbur was looking for more spruce and he couldn't find it. So he was taking pine because that's what they had. But he used a variety of different things for the wood. Might be surprised to know that in many cases, wood can be stronger than steel and some applications of it. So wood actually worked reasonably good. What they used for the fabric was muslin. It was a type of cotton. The interesting thing to me about this muslin they were using is that they would leave a lot of it at Kitty Hawk on the island when they were done that they couldn't bring with them. And the women of the island that were here often used it for building dresses.
All right, and we do have another question. Can you please tell us more about the wind tunnel engine?
It's just a fan, basically. The first wind tunnels they had basically were very simple. They used a fan on one end of it, and then they had it set up so that the wind would go a certain direction where they could do experiments at. It was a crude wind tunnel. The thing that the Wright brothers did that was different than a lot of other people was they were using their wind tunnel experiments for trying to figure out scientific applications. And that was kind of unusual at the time. That was one of the first main uses for aviation research was done by the Wright brothers using a wind tunnel. Now, by the way, the Wright brothers did not invent wind tunnels. That's something I've often heard. Wind tunnels were happening before the Wright brothers. They just perfected it.
And Rex asks, did they make any money from their invention?
That is a great question. All these questions are great, but that's a really neat one because, believe it or not, the Wright brothers didn't have a lot of money at first. They were middle class, I would say, before they got started, but they were very secretive. They wanted to basically have control of the agency. They wanted patents, and because they wanted patents and didn't have patents, they were being very secretive. So they weren't trying to push the airplane to sell. They weren't doing anything until they perfected it and they had that patent. They got the first patent in 1906. That patent wasn't for building the airplane. It was for the system of flight that used controlling it, the wing warping. But once they got the patent, then they could start selling and pushing the airplane for a profit. And Wilbur, he would go overseas to France and fly a new version of the Wright Flyer. It was one he could sit upright on and have two people with as he flew it. And he flew it for the French and other Europeans and had great success. And Orville tried to fly it for the military and at Fort Myers, Virginia. And he would often have a passenger with them to be able to fly with them. But he flew for the military and unfortunately had a terrible accident. Ended up almost killed his passenger. For himself, he didn't die, but he had serious injuries. But he was able to get himself mended with the help of Catherine Wright, the sister, coming down and taking care of him. He was able to fly a year later. By the way, the guy that died, his name was Thomas McSelfridge. He was a lieutenant in the Army. He was the first fatality ever from an airplane. But a year later, they were able to fly again, and this time Orville got a contract from the military. Once they had the contracts and were getting from overseas and the military, that's when the Wright brothers were making lots of money and had to build a company, the Wright Company, for mass producing these airplanes. And then also they had a flight school. First it was in the South, but they moved it to Huffman Prairie in Ohio. Everything was good for the Wright brothers. They ended up having a mansion in Ohio, that they lived in. But one terrible thing happened, and that was Wilbur died in 1912 of typhoid. And when Wilbur died at that age, at that point in time, Wilbur was more comfortable in legal matters and fiscal matters than Orville was. that was largely the end of what was going to happen with the Wright brothers. And Orville largely became a spokesman after that. But yeah, it took them a while before they made money.
All right, and this last one is not a question, but it is several comments from a lot of our participants today. They very much loved your presentation, and they wanted to tell you that you're an excellent storyteller. And I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Stacy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for joining us for today and sharing your passion with us about this important part of our history. This has been really special. So thank you so much.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Normally we would do this outside. We had some technical difficulties today, so that's why I'm in a boring office right now. But whatever the case, please come to Wright Brothers National Memorial if you get the chance to do it. It's an important part of our history, something that I hope that not only every American, but everyone that's interested in the world about flight and technology and understanding the things that it took to change the world we have today. This is one of the special places that shows that.
Absolutely. And on your way to the Outer Banks, we hope that you swing by the museum here in Raleigh. We have multiple Wright Flyer reproductions, as well as a portion of our Story of North Carolina exhibit is devoted to the Wright brothers. I just wanted to share a personal aside that today is our adult program intern Destiny's last program with us. We just want to thank her so much for all of her hard work at the museum this semester. We've really been honored to be a part of her journey. Thank you to all those of you who joined us for today's program. We hope to see you at our next History at High Noon, the intersection of history and medicine, taking place both here in person at the museum and over Zoom on Wednesday, January 10th, 2024. In the meantime, from all of us here at the museum, we hope you all have a lovely, safe holiday season, and we'll see you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.